It's our great pleasure to welcome you for this. I think this is the 8th session of our 2021 CEFREPA lecture series. The French Research Center in the Arabian Peninsula, CEFREPA, is based in Kuwait, Sana'a, Muscat, and Abu Dhabi, and he dedicates its lecture series to the new approaches of the history and culture of Islam. نرحب بكم في الحلقة الثامنة حسبنا لسلسلة محاضرات السيفريبا لعام 2021. يركز المركز الفرنسي للأبحاث في شبه الجزيرة العربية سلسلة محاضراته هذه السنة على الاتجاهات الجديدة لتاريخ الإسلام والثقافات الإسلامية. And I am really happy to have as our keynote speaker today, Dr. Mehdi Berriah, who is an assistant professor at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. He is also an associated researcher at CEFREPA Kuwait, and we are quite proud to have him with us. He is as well a member of the Center for Islamic Theology, the CIT. He's a specialist of war and Mamluk studies. You can see his recently published article on the Mamluk Sultanate and the Mamluk seen by Ibn Taymiyya in the famous Journal of Arabian Humanities, published in 2020. And Dr. Mehdi Berriah is also an editor for the SHARIAsource project based in Harvard Law School, I think. He is finally the director of the Taymiyyan Corpus of Jihad project based in France. His discussant will be Dr. Yasser Al-Lessi. He's an associate professor at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam as well, and he has published widely on Islam. He's a specialist of Quran exegesis. And he also has recently published a couple of articles on reform and democracy and Islam in Europe. Lastly, an article entitled Converse on Converts, doing Islamic theology in a pluralized European context. And also another article, which is a controversial orthodoxy, Al-Ghazali, revival of the religious sciences in 2020. We are really happy to have you tonight as our guest and keynote speakers. And now we leave the floor to Mehdi. Just allow me to remind you that the lecture is recorded, and the recording will be posted on the CEFREPA YouTube channel. And from now on, you can use the Zoom conversation window to write down your questions as they come to your mind. We will open your mic at the end of the lecture so that you can ask Mehdi and Dr. Yasser for everything you would like to ask. And now I leave you the virtual floor, Mehdi and Dr. Yasser. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm very delighted to be here and to have the opportunity to present some research, some result of my research. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Abbas Wash, Dr. Philippe Tria, and Dr. Laurent Bonnefoy, and more generally all the CEFREPA's member for the invitation. In this paper, I will present the first result of my research that I am carrying out in the framework of my project entitled the Ibn Taymiyyan Corpus of Jihad, project that is funded by the French Office of Foreship and also by the French Ministry of Interior. I will just share my screen. I don't know if I can, Philippe, it's okay. I can share a screen? Okay. Thank you. It's okay. Everyone can see? Perfect.
Yes, it's okay.
Okay, it's okay. So Jihad, Ibn Taymiyya, and the historians. So Ibn Taymiyya, who is died in the year 1328, is undeniably one of the most studied medieval Muslim theologians, both in the Arab world and in the West. This phenomenon can be explained by the considerable mass of his writings dealing with various subjects and which contain a rich and complex thought, which continues to have a big impact on contemporary Islam. The following of Taymiyyan studies of the last 2 decades has made it possible to know more about the thought of Ibn Taymiyya, and in particular, his position in matters of dogma, Sufism, logic, philosophy, politics, but also the post-mortem reception of his works and of his thought. However, paradoxically, if today Ibn Taymiyya sounds with rigorism and jihad, in generally speaking, the question of jihad has less interested scholarship than, for example, the relation between Ibn Taymiyya and the philosophy. Of course, we have some works and some scholars showed interest for some aspects for this topic. For example, Emmanuel Sivan in his Radical Islam, or Andrew Bostom has shed light on some aspects of jihad's global design of Ibn Taymiyya. Thomas Raff, Yahya Michaud, Denis Aigle, Teymour Morel, and more recently Emmanuel Fond have offered a better understanding of Ibn Taymiyya's jihad thoughts against Mongols. We can quote also Suleiman Murad and James Lindsay, who were interested in the impact of Ibn Taymiyya thoughts on jihad ideology in general, so propaganda and promotion of jihad. Ibn Taymiyya is often presented as radical and rigorist, since some Salafi groups quote Ibn Taymiyya's for strengthen their religious position, but also because also some jihadist movements quote Ibn Taymiyya in order to legitimate some violent action or terrorism. So Ibn Taymiyya thought is often presented as synonym of obscurantism. But misreading and misunderstanding of Ibn Taymiyya's jihad writings without, and I underline this point, without contextualization, lead to considering him as radical, rigorist, and especially as the contemporary jihadist movement's ideologue. However, a close reading of the substantial scattered material of jihad in Ibn Taymiyya's writing permits to bring out a complex conception of jihad. Moreover, careful examination of the famous Hanbali theologian's writing shows that he is not always as the warlike and extremist scholar as he is often presented. Some of his position regarding fiqh al-jihad could be considered between brackets moderate in comparison to other ulama. Besides, Ibn Taymiyya deals with strategic, practical questions related to jihad, for example, the learning of Furusiya or martial arts, the weapons handling, the use of silk and gold in war, the question of financing jihad, and other topics of this kind, showing by this way reflection and pragmatism regarding jihad. Basing on Ibn Taymiyya's writing and contemporary chronicles, I will try in this paper to give a general overview of Ibn Taymiyya's jihad conception. And if I have enough time, I will try to shed light on some Ibn Taymiyya's positions regarding fiqh al-jihad. I propose you so to follow this following plan for today. So let's start with my first section, Ibn Taymiyya's time, a context of intensive jihad. Ibn Taymiyya is the scholar of the Mamluk era who wrote the most on jihad in order to participate in the jihad as a volunteer within the Mamluk army. The main reason of this production on jihad and of this participation in jihad is undoubtedly the Middle East context, especially that of Syria. Mongol attacks and Mongol invasion, Franks and Armenian raids constituted threat and recurring events that Ibn Taymiyya has experienced closely since his birth. One can think that the forced exile from his hometown from Harran with his family, which he experienced from an early age due to the Mongol advance, was a real trauma that will fuel in part his determination to fight the Mongols. Emmanuel Sivan, for example, speaks about he speaks about a refugee syndrome. It is certain that the Mongol attacks and their share of panic scenes, devastation, massacres, and population captures, of which Ibn Taymiyya witnessed, or at least he heard a lot of stories, must have marked him deeply. The feeling of a constant and unprecedented and faithful threat to Islam, but above all, the fear of what we can call a end, the end, as he writes in one of his fatwa later, so provoked in Ibn Taymiyya the emergence of pro-jihad militancy. His first and unique objective is to defend Islam and the Muslims, according to his writing, against various threats. So both external, Mongols, Armenians, and Franks, but also at the same time internal, with certain, I underline this word, certain Sufi and philosophical doctrines that Ibn Taymiyya considered at odds with his view or his perception about Islamic creed. The context in which Ibn Taymiyya lived and acted constitutes the fundamental element and the framework that must govern any study and interpretation of his conception of jihad and his position regarding his role, al-ahkam, ahkam al-jihad, because this event, this context, had a considerable impact on him. Such an impact can be observed in the writings of Ibn Taymiyya, but also in his life, which are the object of the two following points. So about Ibn Taymiyya's writing. Generally speaking, Ibn Taymiyya deals with jihad or motion jihad less or more in almost all his writings. But we have some of them which are dedicated for this topic. For example, the three well-known anti-Mongol fatwa in this Majmu' al-Fatawa, but also we have other works which are not very known, like Mas'ala fi Murabata bis-Thughur, Mas'alat al-Hizba, al-Siyasa al-Shar'iyya, so is very famous, but also Qa'ida fi al-Inghimaz fi al-Adu, wa hal yubah, and Qa'ida mukhtasara fi qital al-Kufar wa muhanatuhu. I underline that the two last texts, in spite of they are published, they don't attract a lot of researcher on about jihad, and I think their study give a lot of perspective for the study of Ibn Taymiyya and the jihad. We can find also substantial information about jihad in other writings. Among them, I can quote اقتداء صراط المستقيم, الرسالة القبرصية, but also قاعدة في المحبة, المسائل الماردينية, and العبودية. Let's move now to the second section, so about Ibn Taymiyya's jihad experience on the ground. What we can say is that according to the chronicles of the Mamluk period, Ibn Taymiyya had a quite rich experience of jihad in the ground. According to the chronicles, his first experience and his first participation in jihad occurred during the siege of Acre, the last Frankish stronghold of Syria. In the year 1298, Ibn Taymiyya, aged 36 years, was commissioned by Sultan Lajin to preach jihad at the Umayyad Mosque during this summer of this year, in order to encourage and to motivate volunteers, mutatawwi'a, in order to reach the Mamluk army, which was fighting in the ground of the Mamluk, the Armenian kingdom. And as you know, the kingdom of Armenia in this time was the ally of Al-Khanid Mongols, the first adversary, the first enemy of the Mamluk Sultanate. Third participation in the jihad, and I think it is best known, is the Ibn Taymiyya's participation and Ibn Taymiyya's role during the Mongol occupation of Syria during the beginning of the year 1300. These events are well documented, especially with the works of Yahya Mishu, but also Denis Aigle. So Ibn Taymiyya played many roles: ambassador, negotiator for prisoners, but also da'i, preacher, and also psychological support for the Mamluk army, and especially some emirs of Syria. According to the chronicles, we find also Ibn Taymiyya as propagandist in the expeditionary force sent against the dwellers of the mountain of Kisrawan, twice during the same year of the 1300, but in the summer, and the second version during the summer of the year 1305. Lastly, we find also Ibn Taymiyya in the Mamluk army during the winter of the year 1312 and 1330, when al-Jaytu and his army laid siege to Al-Rahba. Al-Rahba is, I think, the strongest stronghold of the Mamluk Sultanate, which is situated in the Euphrates in Iraq, between Iraq and Syria. So Ibn Taymiyya left Cairo with a lot of volunteers, and the Mamluk army led by the Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad. Nevertheless, the news of the advance of the Mamluk army, in addition to the resistance of the Al-Rahba defenders, forced the Mongol Ilkhanid army to go back, to withdraw to Iraq and Iran. Consequently, Ibn Taymiyya, when he arrived at Asqalon, decided to go back to Syria after 7 years of absence. Next point, definitions, representation, and goals of jihad according to Ibn Taymiyya. For Ibn Taymiyya, jihad against unbelievers or hypocrites is an act of worship, ibadah, in the same way as prayer. Okay. So the question is, what is jihad for Ibn Taymiyya? So close reading of his writing shows that for Ibn Taymiyya, jihad has several senses. In his Risala al-Ubudiyya, he says that wal-jihad huwa badl al-wasa' wa huwa al-qudra fi husul mahbub al-haq wa daf ma yakruhu al-haq. Another definition in his Risala entitled Mas'ala fi Murabita, al-jihad for Ibn Taymiyya is tahqiq kawn al-mu'min mu'minan. What we can translate by to the believers to check that he is well believing. To support his words and the definition that he gives, Ibn Taymiyya quotes the prophetic hadith reported by Muslim that say that the believer who during his life would not have fought or formulated his wish to fight will die with one of the characteristics of the hypocrites. Beyond this explanatory definition, Ibn Taymiyya in his Siyasa al-Shar'iyya considers jihad as a kind of punishment, uquba, against the abandonment of the obligation and the practice of prohibitions. In his Qa'ida fil Mahabba, Ibn Taymiyya explains that the final objective of jihad is that religion is all to God and that the word of God is the highest. وأن يكون دين كله لله وأن تكون كلمة الله هي العليا. This slogan is already found in many other ulama before Ibn Taymiyya. For example, I can quote Al-Izz ad-Din Abd al-Salam, the well-known Shafi'i scholars of Egypt, in his Ahkam al-Jihad wa Fadailihi. In his treatise on Hizbah, also Ibn Taymiyya explained a little bit better his thought on jihad by presenting jihad as an instrument for commanding right and forbidding wrong. Of course, this is expression of Quranic text in 2 verses, Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar. Jihad, according to Ibn Taymiyya, is in fact a supplement necessary to complete a system governed by the laws of God. Jihad is an obligation that binds each individual according to his ability. Any respectful man who neglects it commits sin, than to the extent of his ability. To defend his view, Ibn Taymiyya refers to a famous hadith reported by Muslim from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri: من رأى منكم منكرا فليغيره بيده فإن لا يستطيع فبلسانه فإن لا يستطيع فبقلبه وذلك أضعف الإيمان. This hadith is very well known and very popular because we can find it in one of the most popular book in Muslims, and the book is Arba'in Nawawi, the 14 hadith of Imam Nawawi. So now let's move to the following points: jihad as act of worship. For Ibn Taymiyya, the jihad is an act of worship, ibadah, in the same way as prayer, zakat, fasting, pilgrimage, good behavior to one's parents, and so on, as he mentioned it in his Al-Ubudiyya and in other passages. God gave distinctive signs to those who love him: the observance of the Sunnah and the accomplishment of jihad in the path of God. فَجَعَلَ اللَّهُ لأهل محبته علامتين اتباع الرسول والجهاد في سبيل الله. When the believers abandons what he can do in jihad, it is a sign of the weakness of his love for God and his prophet, as you can read in this passage. For Ibn Taymiyya, God established jihad as the basis of his love, asas mahabbatihi, on that of his prophet. Its fulfillment symbolizes the completeness of both love for what God has ordered and hatred for what he has forbidden. بل قد جعل الله أساس محبته ومحبة رسوله الجهاد في سبيل الله والجهاد يتضمن كمال محبة ما أمر الله به وكمال بغض ما نهى عنه. In his Jawab al-Bahir, so Jawab al-Bahir, it's a book about it's interesting because it's a book about the visit of the tombs, and he deals with jihad also. In his book, Jawab al-Bahir, Ibn Taymiyya confirms that performing jihad is obedience to God and his prophet. To substantiate his point, he explains that the bay'ah, allegiance of the companions to the prophet, consisted of obeying him in battle and not fleeing even if they were to die. Thus, it will be understood, for Ibn Taymiyya, the duty of jihad is intrinsically linked to the love of God and of the prophet, and is inseparable from it. It will be a mistake to regard this position as belonging only to Ibn Taymiyya. For some other ulama of the same period, like Ibn Abd al-Zahir, who is also a well-known historian, and Ibn Shaddad, alim and also historian, they consider jihad as like one of the pillars of Islam, namely the sixth pillar of Islam. Interesting is Ibn Taymiyya's explanation of the origins of jihad, which date back to the time of Moses, after he left Egypt in the company of the son of Israel, Banu Israel. Once Moses and Banu Israel arrived in Palestine, the land promised to them, Musa and his people were ordered to fight against the people who were enemies of God at this time. As Ibn Taymiyya points out, God relates in verse 43 of the Surah 28, Surah Al-Qasas, that after the revelation of the Torah, no divine punishment was sent against an unbelieving people. You have the verse, لقد أتينا موسى الكتاب من بعد ما أهلكنا القرون الأولى بصائر للناس وهدى ورحمة لعلهم يتذكرون. So according to this verse, Ibn Taymiyya gives an interpretation that we can schematize as follow. Before Torah, divine punishment and annihilation of unbelieving peoples. But after Torah, according to Ibn Taymiyya, jihad instead of divine punishment and annihilation of unbelieving peoples. The prophecy of Moses and the revelation of the Torah mark a significant turning point in the treatment of unfaithful pupils. Previously, these people were annihilated totally by divine punishments, like the Quran and the Hadith echo about it, like people of Ad, Thamud, people of Shu'aib, Lot, and Pharaoh. Ibn Taymiyya concludes that, therefore, jihad is better for the disbeliever than the destruction by a retribution from heaven. فالجهاد للكفار أصلح من هلاكهم بعذاب السماء. Therefore, Ibn Taymiyya conceives jihad as being the means to improve the situation of the infidels, given that before God legislates and orders Moses to lead the jihad, unbeliever people were systematically annihilated by divine punishment because they refused the message of the prophets. With jihad and by submitting to the authority of believers, infidels, between brackets, avoid annihilation. So now, let's analyze qualities and prominence of jihad in Ibn Taymiyya. The accomplishment of jihad is the expression of many qualities and virtues of the believer. Through the interpretation of a series of verses and hadiths, Ibn Taymiyya sees jihad as the climax of patience, sabr, certainty, al-yaqeen, asceticism, al-zuhd, and sincerity, al-ikhlas. As I told it before, jihad is for Ibn Taymiyya an act of worship, ibadah, but not just any worship. To the question of knowing what is the most meritorious act between withdrawing in one of the three holy mosques to worship God there and stationing in a thar, it's we can translate it by border town in front of the enemy. And stationing in a thar such as Damietta, Tripoli, and Alexandria. So Ibn Taymiyya answer is clear. الحمد لله بل المقام في ثغور المسلمين كالثغور الشامية والمصرية أفضل من المجاورة في المساجد الثلاثة وما أعلم في هذا نزاعا. Ibn Taymiyya provides more details in his رسالة مسألة في المرابطة بالثغور, in which he confirms the consensus al-ijma', according to him, of course, that exists between the four madhahib, legal schools, according to which to station in the thughur with the intention of jihad is more meritorious than to live near Mecca or Medina to worship God there. According to Ibn Taymiyya, the answer to this question is clear to anyone who knows his religion. He deplores the confusion that reigns around the subject among most people because of the emergence of innovation, bid'ah, in the belief and religious practices of Muslims in his time. So you have the explanation in the second extract of المسألة في المرابطة. Through a syllogism based on many hadiths, Ibn Taymiyya attempts to demonstrate the superiority of the merit of ribat, since ribat is a kind of jihad, I mean jins al-jihad, and that it constitutes a more meritorious act than to inhabit near holy mosques for worship, al-mujawara bil-haramain, an act which is a kind of hajj, min jins al-hajj. When asked about the interest in learning archery, learning furusiya, and any knowledge useful for jihad, Ibn Taymiyya replies that it is the best supererogatory act that a believer can perform, more meritorious than any other worship of the supererogatory type, nafila, additional worship. والجهاد أفضل ما تطوع به الإنسان وتطوع أفضل من تطوع الحج وغيره. Throughout his مسألة المرابطة في المرابطة, Ibn Taymiyya shows the preponderant place occupied by jihad in the list of worship, always by relying on the sacrosanct corpus of Islam, Quran, secondly Sunnah, and thirdly companions' word. Acts relating to jihad have more merits than those relating to pilgrimage, such as the fact of wanting to stay near holy place, as I told you before. Doing jihad is more meritorious than remaining in a perpetual state of prayer and fasting. And lastly, depending on the context, jihad becomes more important than hajj, pilgrimage, which is a fifth pillar of Islam. Besides worship, jihad is the best way, according to Ibn Taymiyya, for the believer to repent and to obtain absolution of his sins. ومن كان كثير الذنوب فأعظم دوائه الجهاد فإن الله عز وجل يغفر ذنوبه كما أخبر الله في كتابه بقوله and so on. The ribat, lands of jihad, are by definition the best places. وكانت الثغور معمورة بخيار المسلمين علما وعملا وأعظم البلاد إقامة بشرائع الإسلام وحقائق الإيمان والأمر بالمعروف والنهي عن المنكر and so on. Ibn Taymiyya reports the well-known word of the famous and illustrious alim and also mujahid Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak from Ahmad ibn Hanbal إذا اختلف الناس في الشيء فانظروا ما عليه أهل الثغر فإن الحق معهم لأن الله تعالى يقول والذين جاهدوا فينا لنهدينهم سبلنا. And regarding the Thur, as Ibn Taymiyya reminds us in his writing, Syria has been a thar since the beginnings of Islam against Rome, Byzantines, and is still in its day against the Armenians, the Franks, and the Mongols. So we have clearly a parallel from the Islamic past of the beginning of Islam and his time. This is why the Prophet, according to Ibn Taymiyya, gave more credit to the people of Syria than to those of Yemen or Iraq. Moreover, for Ibn Taymiyya, the Muslims who fight in Syria are the most likely to be concerned by the prophetic hadith on the victorious group, what we call in Arabic, according to the hadith, al-Ta'ifa al-Mansura. And what is interesting, it is that according to Ibn Taymiyya, God will support this group and this group will never lost. What is interesting is that at the end of his Aqidah al-Wasitiyya, which is one of his famous book, and his Iqtida fi Sirat al-Mustaqim, Ibn Taymiyya invokes God to permit him to be part of the Ta'if al-Mansura. Okay, you can look at the end of the citation. فَنَسْأَلُ اللَّهَ أَنْ يَجْعَلَنَا مِنْهُمْ وَأَنْ لَا يُزِغْ قُلُوبَنَا بَعْدَ إِذْ هَدَانَا. We have the same mention in his Iqtida fi Sirat al-Mustaqim. If jihad may be more meritorious than the pilgrimage and the fast of Ramadan, in some cases, according to Ibn Taymiyya, we can ask, what about prayer, which is the second most important pillar? Several elements taken from the Quran and the Sunnah indicate that the prayer can be performed differently in times or war, by working on amount, and we can also shorten some prayers according to the Quran and the Sunnah. And we have, for example, clear verses about that in the Surah 2, Al-Baqarah, Zukaw. حافظوا على الصلوات وصلاة الوسطى وقوموا لله قانتين فإن خفتم, if you fear, فرجالا أو ركبانا, on your foot or on your mount. And we have also many other hadiths which support this permission. There are also specific facilities and authorization within the trip framework which differ according to the madhahib. This change in prayer in the context of war shows the importance of jihad. However, no text, as far as I know, no text says to stop war or jihad for prayer. Instead, prayer should be performed in such a way that the conduct of jihad is not hindered. All this material leads Ibn Taymiyya to say that ولو كان تكميل الصلاة مقدما على الجهاد لكان ينبغي أن يترك الجهاد إذا علم أنه لابد فيه من تحقيق الصلاة. So what Ibn Taymiyya wants to draw attention to here is that the text clearly shows that the war effort in the context of jihad takes priority over any religious obligation, including prayer. An objective view of the international situation. Beyond his theological discourses on jihad, the examination of the writings of Ibn Taymiyya make it possible to learn about his opinion and his vision of jihad led by Muslims in his time, an era marked by many threats on different fronts. As you know, in the east against the Mongols, Franks, Armenians, and also in the west and in the Maghreb against the Christian powers. At first glance, we notice that Ibn Taymiyya was very well informed of the political military situation and the events underway in his time. from Al-Andalus to Syria via the Arabian Peninsula. So I cannot read all this paragraph, so I let you to read. So the question is the following one: how did Ibn Taymiyya get all this information about the political and military situation of the Muslim world? Although he never held such high offices as, for example, Qadi al-Qudat, he was appointed by Sultan Najin, as we have seen, official lawyer and propagandist for the expedition launched against the Kingdom of Armenia in the year 1298. During the occupation, Ibn Taymiyya was a key element in the struggle against the Ghazan troop, playing the role of advisor, pusher, and diplomat. On several occasions, Ibn Taymiyya gave his support to the Emir of Syria and was even sent to Cairo by Al-Afram in order to urge and encourage Sultan Muhammad al-Nasir and the other emirs to come to Syria for fighting the Mongol enemy. This closeness of the ruling elite most likely enabled him to gain important information. Moreover, he stays in Mecca for pilgrimage, but also in Cairo and Alexandria, undeniably enabling him to obtain information from traders and travelers from the Maghreb. And those traders and travelers from the Maghreb, we know that probably they informed Ibn Taymiyya about the Al-Muhad movement and about Ibn Tumart's thought, against whom Ibn Taymiyya issued a fatwa refuting and condemning the point of Ibn Tumar's doctrine and his innovative practices. We can also assume that Ibn Taymiyya collected information on the religious, political, and military situation in the Maghreb and Al-Andalus by exchanging with pilgrims from the Muslim West. We know that some of them resided for a while in Damascus after the pilgrimage for many reasons, trade and study. Ibn Taymiyya gives in this paragraph an overall picture of the Muslim world situation in his time in one of his fatwa against the Mongols, written most likely around the year 1300. And this paragraph shows that Ibn Taymiyya was fairly well informed. It is necessary here to underline the objectivity with which Ibn Taymiyya analyzes the difficult situation in which the territories of Dar al-Islam find themselves in his time. Ibn Taymiyya is well aware that the threats have never been more significant and that the power of the Islam's enemies, especially the Mongol, was still considerable at the time. Regarding the Mongol invasion, he says, moreover bluntly, that they are unique events which, by their magnitude and their upheavals, they engendered, go beyond the norm and look nothing like any other. فإن هذه الحادثة, namely the Mongol invasions, كان فيها أمور عظيمة جازت حد القياس وخرجت عن سنن العادة. In his اقتباس في صراط المستقيم, Ibn Taymiyya confirms his previous statements by asserting that the Mongols did to the servants and the countries what never before had happened in the land of Islam. فعلوا في العباد والبلاد ما لم يجري في دولة الإسلام. The Ilkhanid Mongols, according to Ibn Taymiyya, posed a mortal danger for Ibn Taymiyya, which directly threatened the existence of Islam. لو استولى هؤلاء, so هؤلاء refers to the Mongols, المحاربون لله ورسوله والمحدون الله ورسوله والمعادون لله ورسوله على أرض الشام ومصر. So أرض الشام ومصر, of course, it indicates المملوك Sultanate. في مثل هذا الوقت لأفضى ذلك إلى زوال دين الإسلام ودروس شرائعه. So this statement from Ibn Taymiyya lead us to think about his perception, which was, I think, between nostalgia and hope. While Islam was threatened with extinction, the resistance of the Mamluk Sultanate to the Mongols the protection of Syria, as well as the safeguard of the Ummah, are clear signs, according to Ibn Taymiyya, of the support from God, which only people with intelligence, ذو العقل, can perceive. In addition to an inward-oriented defensive jihad to be carried out to purify Islam of all deviant belief and practices, Ibn Taymiyya also wants to arm jihad to be carried out against external enemies. In short, a kind of double jihad, an internal doctrinal jihad, another one, armored external jihad. After God permitted the conquest of the Frankish territories and their final expulsion from Syria, Ibn Taymiyya hoped to attack the lands of Christians. He warns the Franks, notably the Cypriot prince in his Risala al-Qubrusiyya, against revenge by Muslims after raids on the Syrian coast, somehow predicting the conquest of Cyprus, which will take place later in summer 1426 and during the reign of Sultan Bazbay. Iraq will also be conquered, God willing, says Ibn Taymiyya. This last project of the conquest of Iraq had been expressed by several sultans, such as Baybars, al-Ashraf Khalil, and Muhammad al-Nasir. Ibn Taymiyya goes further by asserting that we must fight the Mongols in their countries until they abandon the erroneous doctrine of Islam. He calls all Muslims in all religions to help each other and fight the infidels in a kind of a dream. It's a dream, an utopia of Muslim unity and of a global jihad. فيجب على المسلمين من جود الشام ومصر واليمن والمغرب جميعهم أن يكونوا متعاونين على قتال الكفار وليس لبعضهم أن يقاتل بعضا بمجرد الرياسة والأهوة. Also, in practical and utopian in this context, Ibn Taymiyya's plan for conquest reveal his fierce pugnacity, determination, and activism. A certain nostalgia can explain these character traits. As a good expert of Islamic history, Ibn Taymiyya evokes the glorious time, ancient and recent of Islam, referring to the time when Cyprus and Syria-Lebanese coast were Muslims before being reconquered by Christians less than 300 years ago, to the Islamic conquest against the Byzantines, as well to Sis, capital to the Kingdom of Armenia, and to Tarsus, which were previously Thar min al-Thur of Muslims. Finally, Ibn Taymiyya include in these successes the previous Ayyubid victories against the Crusaders, as well as the exploits of the Mamluks since Ain Jalut, by evoking territories that were Muslims, but no longer so in his time, and from which attacks against Dar al-Islam are now starting. One discovers in the background the expression of nostalgia and even, we can say, melancholy in Ibn Taymiyya. He is aware, on the one hand, that Islamic authority is declined in his time, compared to past times, and on the other hand, he knows that the sweat of Islam, compared to the period when Islam was triumphant, so these threats are now deadly. So to conclude, examination and confrontation of some Ibn Taymiyya's writings bring out a quite complex conception of jihad. For him, jihad is one of the most important worship for a Muslim and one of the means necessary for the completion of a system governed by the laws of God. Ibn Taymiyya's interest for the completion of Ibn Taymiyya's interest and dedication to discussing jihad and adopting a hawkish attitude seems to have been the result, in part, of the trauma caused by the Mongol danger when he was child, and when he fled with his family, and to which he was exposed most of his life. Yes, we have to keep in mind that life of Ibn Taymiyya's life corresponds with the duration of the Mamluk and Mongols war. Ibn Taymiyya's conception of jihad, it has been said, can only be studied and understood by taking into account the context of his time. Through an historical and Quranic approach, Ibn Taymiyya points out that jihad must be considered as an instrument improving the condition of the unbelieving peoples, because jihad replaces the previous legislation of God, who annihilated them totally by a retribution from heaven. Theorizing his ideology of jihad from a rigorous interpretation of the sacred text, Ibn Taymiyya does not fail to integrate the data of his time. Leading jihad at the start of the 14th century was not easy. The threats were numerous, the enemies powerful, and the weakness and the Muslim world was very weak. Suffering setbacks in the West found it difficult to resist in the Middle East. In addition, several Muslim territories were plagued by internal dissension, as in Ifriqiya. Still others were too weak, like Yemen. The social political upheavals caused by the Mongol invasion, in particular the fact that large Muslim population lived under the domination of Mongols, first pagans, then who convert to Islam, had a real impact on Ibn Taymiyya's worldview, which is more complex and pragmatic than a simple bipolarization opposing the Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb or Kufr. The proof is in his fatwa al-Masail al-Mardiniyya, Ibn Taymiyya inserts a new identity, which is the Dar al-Murakkab, a kind of mix of, on one side, some institution of Dar al-Islam and some institution of Dar al-Harb or al-Kufr. These conclusions are not definitive, of course, but they constitute only first results. To complete this analysis of Ibn Taymiyya's jihad conception, it is necessary to study his position on jihad fiqh issues like breaking fast for jihad, effort, the mukus and finance jihad, and so on. The sacrifice for the group's interest is authorized, and disbelief is not a condition for fighting non-Muslim. All these issues that I already studied them give not I will not say a kind of contradiction, but I think a sign of the evolution of Ibn Taymiyya's jihad conception. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mehdi. We
Yes.
are running short of time, so I leave the floor directly to Dr. Yasser Al-Lisi for his discussion.
I apologize for my delay. It
was challenging and beautiful.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, again, and thank you, Dr. Berriah and Dr. Zouash for the invitation, and thank you, Mehdi, for this wonderful presentation, which was very insightful and also challenging. So because I understand that I have maximum 15 minutes, I will delve into the discussion directly. So my first remark is that I see that there's a part dedicated in your paper to trying to prove whether Ibn Taymiyya was a kind of mujahid, also by sword, or he was just a propagandist for the jihad against the Tatars and other allies of them. I was wondering whether this the relevance of this to the discussion, because I think it does not need so much effort to prove that to prove his jihadism, even with the sword, as some of the scholars and contemporary and pupils has discussed this. And I see actually his whole career and enterprise as a sort of a continuous intellectual and physical jihad. Permit me to share with you some words of my presentation during a lecture where we invited one of the specialists from Ibn Taymiyya, my colleague John Hofer, in 2018, and these words were what I choose to introduce the controversy about Ibn Taymiyya, this polymath medieval scholar.
Sorry, Dr. Yasser, may I just ask Mehdi to stop his screen sharing?
Yes.
Thank you.
Please.
Sorry for interrupting.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah. Ibn Taymiyya, a polymath medieval scholar with almost 300 volumes of genuine authorship, covering variant subjects on aqidah, on jihad, and fiqh, and so on, can hardly be missed in theological discussions, public debates, preaching, publications, including high-level academic works, and within and outside the Muslim world. But his work can always offer not only a fruitful literature for study, but also an elusive material with much controversy. One always wonder about Ibn Taymiyya. Does he promote mercy, tolerance, and spirituality, or violence, intolerance, excommunication, takfir, and persecution of those who do not comply with his doctrines? Like many works he wrote about Sirat al-Mustaqim, Khalafat Ashab al-Jahim, and other works, Minhaj al-Sunnah, and so on, and his severe attack on Shiaism, on Sufism, while he is, for example, when it comes to Sufism, what is his precise view on Sufism? He seems to sympathize with Al-Junayd, but at the same time, he harshly criticizes Ibn Arabi and justifies the execution of Al-Hallaj. Now, is he a conspicuous foe of non-Muslims? And I will come to this point later, Mehdi, especially Christians and Jews, or an uncompromising advocate of their rights, protection, and freedoms in a Muslim context? And this is something that you mentioned, Ghazan, that he mentions in Majmu' al-Fatawa, when he refused Ghazan's, the Mongol leader's proposal to exclude Christian and Jews prisoners who were captured by the Mongols in Jerusalem, the Quds. And Ibn Taymiyyah said, and this has remained as a maximum for many Muslim pluralists, he said, we will never leave a single captive, neither from Ahl al-Millah nor from Ahl al-Dhimma. It's nowadays it's used Ahlu Dhimmatina qabla Ahli Millatina. So, is he an upholder of the true tenets of Islamic faith, on the madhab of the Salaf concerning the image of God, his transcendence, attributes, and theodicy, or a founder of a heretic creed in the claim of his critics, inciting anthropomorphisms, tashbih and tajsim, the annihilation of hellfire, fana in-nar, consequently the non-internal chastisements of unbelievers in hell? Is that a genuine Ibn Taymiyyah or another misquoted Ibn Taymiyyah by both Ibn Battuta and his pupil Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah? Is he the exemplary orthodox Hanbali jurist, or the flexible mufti on cases sometimes breaks the unanimous consensus among the Sunni law schools, as in the case of famous Damascene fatwa on verbal divorce, talaq, which resulted in his imprisonment? So the question is, who is the real Ibn Taymiyyah among all these virgins? One would remain with the question, is this not the case with many other, if not all, Muslim scholars like Al-Ghazali, his pupil Ibn Qayyim, why his name jumped into any discussion with many isms, Salafism, Wahhabism, fundamentalism, radicalism, jihadism, and many other isms? While some of his disciples are not less known, such as Ibn Kathir, for example, the exegete, prominent jurist of Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, and al-Dhahabi, the historian and the leading hadith scholar. So leaving this point, I come to some points that you discussed in your paper. I want to touch this currently for the sake of time, very quickly. When we say that it would be a mistake to regard his position as belonging to Ibn Taymiyyah, this position, for some other author of the Mamluk period like Ibn Abd al-Zahir and Shaddad, among others, jihad is one of the pillars of Islam. I think this is one of the established, also through scriptural sources, opinions, and there is a consensus already since the formative period of Islam about the centrality of jihad as one of pillars of Islam. And there's also a hadith which is also in acceptable. It is in the Hasan level of evaluation of hadith, which the Prophet said, رأس الأمر الإسلام وعموده الصلاة وذروة سنامه الجهاد. I was also struggling when you say that commenting on what he says, the interpretation of قاتل الذين لا يؤمنون بالله ولا باليوم الآخر ولا يحرمون ما حرم الله ورسوله from Surah Al-Tawbah, that for Ibn Taymiyya, I quote you, this verse indicates that God ordered to fight all the communities which do not believe, and to fight them until they enter the religion or pay the poll tax, al-jizya. Jihad must be carried out until the complete disappearance of shirk. Ibn Taymiyya call verses 36 of Surah 8, Al-Anfal, to support his words. وَقَاتِلُوهُمْ حَتَّى لَا تَكُونَ فِتْنَةً وَيَكُونَ الدِّينُ كُلُّهُ لِلَّهِ. And then you say immediately after, he gives his interpretation of the verse in question. فأمر بالجهاد حتى لا تكون فتنة وحتى يكون الدين كله لله فجعل المقصود عدم كون الفتنة ووجود كون دين الله الدين كله لله وناقض بينهما فكون الفتنة ينافي كون الدين وكون الدين لله وكون الدين لله ينافي كون الفتنة. Now, if I look at the exegesis of his pupil Ibn Kathir, who died in 774 Hijri, I don't think so. The term fitna in the Quran has 15 different meanings according to a Quranic exegetic science that is called the al-wujuh al-nadha'ir, with authorships in al-Askari and al-Damaghani. And in the commentary of Ibn Kathir, he gives examples about al-fitna al-ula هي التي أخرجت من خرج من أصحاب رسول الله إلى الحبشة. So fitna remains on the side of the Muslims. It's nothing else than the risk to be brought back by violence to polytheism after being a Muslim. And this is the meaning that we read in Surah Al-Baqarah and in other verses. And then he says, وَطَفِقَ أَهْلُ الْمَدِينَةِ يَأْتُونَ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ بِمَكَّةِ. And when Quraysh saw that, they conspired to يَفْتِنُوهُم, to bring them back to polytheism. So fitna here is something that jihad, I think, in the eyes of Ibn Taymiyya, is legitimate for, and this is what I think is confirmed in his exegesis of verses like Surah Al-Mumtahana, Surah 60. This is the framework of fighting or jihad, of being in discontent with the unbelievers of non-Muslims. That the two conditions are that Muslims are not fought for their belief and are not driven out from their houses, right? And we have the consent of Ibn Taymiyya on this. So after that, you build upon this idea and you say jihad is better for the disbeliever than their destruction by a retribution from heaven, quoting Ibn Taymiyya. Therefore, Ibn Taymiyya, I quote you, conceives jihad as being the mean to improve the situation of the infidels. I saw this in the presentation. I wonder here and ask a question. Is kufr then the only reason to fight non-Muslims? And does this entail soteriological conversion by the sword, as Isis claims? Is that what he propagates in his scholarly career and theology? For example, if we look at one of his, I would say, until recently missed works and also controversial, قاعدة مختصرة في قتال الكفار ومهادنتهم وتحريم قتلهم لمجرد كفرهم. And if I read fiqh al-jihad, the 2-volume work of Qaradawi, published in 2009, he dedicates one of his chapters to Ibn Taymiyya's tolerant approach concerning jihad and fighting non-Muslims. So he says, and this is the point I want to touch about being very careful about the publications of Ibn Taymiyya. We all know that it was under the auspices of the Saudis. And there are many discussions, and I would be very happy if one of the scholars of future PhD students would write his thesis in this, how selective some publications are based on many manuscripts. Because as al-Qaradawi claims in his book, and I quote him, he says, about this work, لشيخ الإسلام Ibn Taymiyya has a treatise on قتال الكفار. أيد فيها هذا الرأي. We know that the Jumhur, the Maliki, the Ahnaf, the Malikiya, and the Hanabila, they say that the non-Muslims should not be fought for unbelief. They should not be fought only for unbelief. But Shafi'i is the only one who is differing from this opinion. And he says, Ibn Taymiyya supports the meaning of the Jumhur. And this was denied by some scholars of Saudi Arabia. And they denied to put this work in the Majmu' al-Fatawa that was published by them in 37 volumes until Abdul Aziz al-Zir has published this work. And if we read this work, it's totally telling us the opposite. He tells us that the only reason to make jihad is fighting the Muslims, putting the Muslim in fitna, and trying to bring them back to polytheism. And this is what he means by fitna, and this is what he means by أن يكون الدين لله. He says, for example, والفتنة يفتن المسلم عن دينه. Fitna is that a Muslim should be tested to leave his religion. As the polytheists, كما كان المشركون يفتنون من أسلم عن دينه. Okay, وهذا إنما يكون إذا اعتدوا, if they attack the Muslims, and the Muslim has a sultan, they have a political authority, وحينئذ يجب قتالهم. In this case, they should be fought. حتى لا تكون فتنة, so that there would be no fitna for the Muslims. So as he said, I think that reading him in the context of his works, and because this is a risky statement, and just allow me to show you something from one of my presentations. I hope you can see it on the screen. So Ibn Taymiyya is criticized for being cited by ISIS in their publications. And this is one of the things that they claim. The Islam is the religion of this world, as they cite here in chapter 20 of this publication. Islam is the religion of this world, not pacifism. And if I remind you of the execution of 21 Copts, Christians, Egyptians in 2015 in Libya by ISIS, this guy here in a famous video on YouTube, he presented his speech by saying, وَالصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ عَلَى مَنْ بُعِثَ بِالسَّيْفِ رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. Peace and mercy be upon him. The one who was sent by the sword is mercy for humankind. And they justify many of these perspectives by quoting Ibn Taymiyya. So I don't want to defend Ibn Taymiyya, but what I want to say is that we have to be careful about his published works, because there are so many selections and things that are preferred to be published, and other things that has to be hidden. And I think that his approach to jihad, especially against non-Muslims, is in line with the mainstream Muslim fiqh schools. I see that I already used my 15 minutes, and I want to respect the time, so I will stop here. Thank you very much again, Mehdi, and we have learned a lot from your wonderful presentation.
Okay. We learned a lot from you, Dr. Yasser, as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Maybe we have many questions. So I think Abbas Wash would like to enter the field as well.
Okay, so I will
Yeah.
okay, because what Yasser, thank you Yasser for all this remark and relevant question, because you in a certain way you continue what I wanted to present. So I think we will have time in the future to discuss this point later, but very relevant remark. I prefer maybe Abbas Wash.
With pleasure. I don't hear Abbas.
Yeah,
I don't hear Abbas.
We do not hear you.
He's unmuted, but there's a problem with the microphone, I think.
Yes.
You are not audible.
Yes.
Yes.
But yes, thank you for this relevant remark, Yasser.
You're welcome.
Because yes, a lot of things I didn't can to by lack of time. You can imagine, but I agree with maybe all that you said. So it is more complex than we present the things. Yes. Especially the ambivalent character traits of Ibn Taymiyya, or maybe we can qualify that sometimes his complex or contradictory mindset or personality.
Yeah.
And
this
also,
man, sorry.
And also the evolution of the man. So as every man, so we have a kind of evolution, intellectual evolution.
Sure.
So I think there is many things on this side that we have to discuss. But I don't know if Abbas.
I think he's still.
I think you still have a couple of minutes. No, Abbas, we don't hear you. Yeah. So if you could develop maybe on the topics of
if I can, because yes.
And what is kufr?
Yes.
One of the important points that I want to touch now that Abbas is preparing his audio is it's not only the publication of the works. I don't say that I don't trust. I tend to be doubtful about being published in Saudi Arabia and the selectiveness. And this is not only my opinion. I read this book many years ago, fiqh al-jihad of Qaradawi, and I was astonished by this. That he said that he has been looking for this treatise about Risala fi Muqatalat al-Kuffar. He was looking. It is mentioned among the works of Ibn Taymiyya, but it's not published in Majmu' al-Fatawa, 37 volumes by Saudi Arabia. And he said, I was looking here and there. And after that, I discovered that Zir has published it in a critical edition. And this is clear evidence that they denied to publish it because it's against the doctrine of fighting non-Muslims. And in a second incident, I supervised a PhD student who came to me one day, and he said, I was astonished by a citation in that book, citing Ibn Taymiyya, that he puts the punishment of ta'zir for apostasy. I said, what? And then we went back to the publication, and we managed to get the manuscript from the States, and it was totally a misquotation. So I don't say that there are very controversial texts in Ibn Taymiyya. John Hoover agrees, Yahya Mishu agrees, that he can very, let us say, quickly and simply and easily quoted by fundamentalist and militant groups in comparison to other. But at the end of the day, if you blame him, we can blame the Quran. When ISIS, for example, burns the Jordanian pilot using 16-126 in عاقبتم فعاقبوا بمثل ما عوقبتم به. So if you blame Ibn Taymiyya for being quoted, we have to blame the Quran for being quoted by these militant groups.
Yes, they used also a fatwa from Ibn Taymiyya. I guess it's okay. Huh? I heard you. Yes,
it's okay now. Yeah, thank you, and I'm sorry, and thank you for your very important presentation, Mehdi, and for your remarks. Yes, and it's a pleasure and a great honor to welcome you.